The city was Jack's muse. Its chaotic symphony of car horns, distant sirens and late-night laughter fueled his creative fire. At 32, he was a creature of the night, spending his days in a small, cluttered apartment filled with musical instruments and sheet music. His nights were spent either lost in the energy of live concerts or pouring his soul into composing haunting melodies on his piano. The outside world faded away when music filled his ears. He was alone, but never lonely, or so he thought.
One evening, as the last notes of my latest composition faded into the silence, I noticed something strange. A flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye.
He turned his head sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the usual shadows cast by his furniture in the dim light of the city that streamed through his window. He dismissed it as fatigue and went back to his music. But the feeling of being watched lingered. A prickle of unease crawled up his spine, pulled up. The following night, the shadows returned. This time they were more pronounced, darker and more defined than the ordinary shadows cast by his belongings. They seemed to writhe and twist like living things struggling to break free from the darkness that held them captive.
I watched, transfixed, as one shadow in particular, elongated and sinister, stretched out from beneath my bookshelf. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, beckoning me closer.
A shiver ran down his spine, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin. He knew he should look away, should get up and turn on more lights, banish the shadows back into the depths from which they came. But something held him rooted to the spot, a mixture of fear and a strange, morbid curiosity. What were these shadows, and what did they want? As the days turned into nights, the shadows grew bolder. They were no longer content to lurk at the edges of his vision. They began to encroach upon his space, creeping closer and closer, their forms becoming more distinct. He began to hear whispers, faint at first like the rustling of leaves outside his window. But as the shadows grew stronger, so did the whispers, morphing into guttural murmurs that sent chills down his spine.
The whispers were unsettling, ancient, and full of malice. They spoke of forgotten things, of darkness and despair, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself that it was all in my head, the product of stress and overwork. But deep down, I knew the truth. These shadows were real, and they were closing in.
One particularly harrowing night, the shadows finally revealed their true nature. They swirled and danced around Jack, no longer mere silhouettes, but taking on grotesque, almost human forms. Their eyes, glowing red embers in the darkness, stared at him with a hunger that chilled him to the bone. He was surrounded, trapped in a macabre ballet of darkness that threatened to consume him whole.
Terror, raw and primal, seized my heart. I understood now. These were not simply shadows, but dark entities, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. I had to escape.
He stumbled back from the horrifying spectacle, knocking over a lamp in his haste. The room was plunged into darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then a cacophony of inhuman shrieks pierced the darkness, followed by the sickening sound of claws scraping against the wooden floor. Section 5, Flight from Phantoms.
Panic overwhelmed him.
Jack scrambled to his feet, knocking over furniture in his blind rush for the door. He could hear the shadows closing in, their whispers turning into menacing growls. His hand found the doorknob slick with sweat, and he threw the door open and stumbled into the hallway. He didn't dare look back. He could feel their presence behind him, their icy breath on his neck. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat urging him onward. He had to get help, had to tell someone, anyone, what was happening. But who would believe him? Who would believe that the shadows themselves had come to life and were hunting him through the night? Section 6, The Unseen Companion.
The city streets, usually his sanctuary, offered no comfort tonight.
Every flickering streetlight seemed to cast an ominous shadow. Every dark alleyway a potential hiding place for the creatures that pursued him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, his legs burning with exhaustion, but he didn't dare slow down. To stop was to be consumed by the darkness that clung to him like a shroud. He could still hear them, their whispers slithering through the night air, their chilling laughter echoing off the walls of the buildings that lined the street. They were toying with him, herding him like prey, reveling in his terror. He was a puppet dancing to their tune, and the strings were tightening around him with every passing moment.
As he ran, a horrifying truth dawned on him. He couldn't outrun them. They were a part of him now, tethered to his fear, feeding off his despair. Wherever he went, they would follow. He was trapped, not in a physical sense, but in a prison of his own terror, a nightmare from which there was no escape.
He collapsed on a park bench, his body spent, his spirit broken. He looked up at the night sky, seeking solace in the vastness above. But the shadows were there too, twisting and writhing among the stars, mocking his helplessness. He was theirs now, body and soul.
The world around him began to blur. The familiar sights and sounds of the city faded, replaced by a cold gray mist that swirled around him, drawing him deeper into its embrace. He was no longer on familiar ground. This was their domain, a realm of shadows and whispers, where fear reigned supreme.
He could see them now, clearer than ever before. Their forms were no longer vaguely human, but twisted and grotesque, their features contorted in expressions of pure malice. They were creatures of nightmare, born of darkness and despair, and he was trapped in their world, a plaything for their amusement.
He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He was paralyzed, his body frozen in place by a terror so profound it defied description. He could only watch in mute horror as the shadows closed in, their cold, clammy hands reaching out to caress his face, his throat, their touch sending shivers of pure dread down his spine.
And then everything went black. The shadows had won. They had claimed him as their own, dragging him down into the abyss. His screams swallowed by the darkness, his light extinguished forever. He was gone, lost in the endless night of his own fear. The city, oblivious to the horrors that unfolded within its heart, continued its relentless rhythm. Life went on, a cacophony of sound and fury, masking the silent screams of those consumed by the darkness. For in the depths of every shadow there lies a fear waiting to be awakened. A fear that whispers of forgotten things, of ancient evils that lurk just beyond the veil of reality. A fear that reminds us that we are never truly alone, that the darkness is always watching, waiting for its moment to claim us. And sometimes, when the lights are low and the shadows grow long, we can almost hear them, the whispers from the abyss calling our name, beckoning us to join them in the eternal night. All we have to do is give in,